I've been shooting with the Nikon Coolpix P1000 for a while now and wanted to share a few thoughts about this camera and my experiences using this camera for bird photography. And I'll be comparing it mostly against using a mirrorless camera, in my case a Panasonic G9, which is not this camera, but it's the one that I'm filming this video on, with a 100 to 400 zoom lens, which is the equivalent in full frame of 200 to 800 millimeters. So the reason I got the P1000 is probably pretty obvious. It's because the zoom range on this camera is 125x, which is the equivalent of 3000 millimeters, and 35 millimeter or full frame, which is about the equivalent of 60x in a spotting scope. And the reason it's different is because while the camera comparison is to a 35 millimeter lens, which is the size of a full frame sensor, the comparison to a spotting scope is, or the zoom ratio that a spotting scope uses is for the human eye, which is about 50 millimeters. So it's not a direct comparison, but it's about the equivalent of a 60x spotting scope. So what's good about this camera? Well, it definitely does what it's advertised to do, which is give you a very long zoom range. It's surprisingly good for video. It shoots 4K video, and the quality of the video is pretty clean and pretty clear. The color quality of the video is pretty good. You can shoot it handheld, not really up to 3000 millimeters, but you can shoot handheld pretty well up to maybe 1500 millimeters. And that's because the in-body image stabilization in the P1000 is really, really good. And that's something to be compared against spotting scopes, which have, even on the very high end, no image stabilization, so they can pretty much only be used on a tripod. The P1000 at 3000 millimeters, you wouldn't really want to use it off of a tripod, but you can. You can definitely at least identify a bird really far away without a tripod. Although when I go out with it, I've generally tried to take a tripod and found that to be the best way to shoot with it. The battery life on the P1000 is good. It uses these tiny batteries. This is not the Nikon ones, this is a generic one. And I thought it would be, an hour of use and that would be it. You have to change the battery. But in reality, I found that I can usually go for a full morning of birding, which would be 3 or 4 hours with only one battery, or maybe with 1.5 batteries. And you can buy these generic ones, use at your own risk, of course, but for $20 for 2 of them. And you also get a charger with it. So that's what I've been doing for the batteries. Another good part of this camera is the autofocus. It's actually pretty good. I was concerned that it being a bridge camera, as they say, or just not an interchangeable lens camera, that the autofocus wouldn't be great. That's been surprisingly good. There is sometimes, especially at the longer range of the focal length, a bit of hunting to find focus, but it's actually quite minimal. The focus speed is not the problem. That does bring up maybe a con with the camera, which is that if you're used to shooting with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you're going to find that the responsiveness of the camera is not quite the same. It definitely is noticeably slower. So you'll take a photo and the blackout period after the photo is longer, even if you're shooting on the lower continuous mode of the camera. It just feels a little more sluggish. And that makes it, in my experience, at least so far, definitely not ideal for birds in flight, even at a normal focal length. So at a focal length where this lens will be fine shooting a bird in flight at 400 millimeters, the P1000, I feel, would definitely struggle a bit with being able to find the bird and then take a shot, and especially if you wanted to take more than one shot in a row. It does have a high frame rate burst mode. I don't remember exactly how many frames that is per second because I haven't used it too much. And the reason for that is because after you shoot one of these bursts, the right time, or the blackout period that prevents you from doing anything, from zooming the camera, from using the menus, or obviously from taking another shot, is several seconds long. So I would rather take my chances with the slower burst rate, where there is still a bit of a lag, but there's not that long wait time after you finish the burst. Another con with this camera, especially in Seattle, where it's often pretty wet out, is that it's not weather sealed, and I haven't really wanted to push my luck too much with that. Usually what I'll do is I'll take a plastic bag or my hat or something and throw it over the camera if it starts getting drizzly and wet outside, and then I won't even take it out at all if it's raining, or at least raining in Seattle style, which is barely raining, but still, with it not being weather sealed, that's a pretty big disadvantage over a spotting scope. I've seen a couple people talk about how the eyepiece might not be that comfortable if you're out there standing for a long time shooting, and I can see how that could be the case. I don't own a spotting scope, so I don't know how comfortable it is, but I have used them many times. And I don't think that there's that big of a difference. Now, the one thing that is a big difference and may or may not matter to you is that if you're looking at a bird through this camera, you're looking at a digital representation of the bird because it's a mirrorless camera, and you're looking through an electronic viewfinder or through the LCD screen on the back. So where with a spotting scope, you're looking at an actual reflected light off of the bird. So whether or not that matters to you, I don't know. It doesn't make that big of a deal to me. In fact, I didn't even think of that until I started making this video. So that's something to consider. In low light conditions, this camera is not going to take good photographs. It will, if you push the ISO up above about 400, the lowest being 100, the graininess is pretty unacceptable. So you need good light to take good photos. But even in low light conditions, looking at the birds through the viewfinder is pretty good, and taking video is pretty good. The video in lower light, meaning like a typical Seattle overcast day, is definitely acceptable quality. The photos, again, are not. But on a day with a little bit of light, I've gotten some pretty decent photos out of this. Never anything nearly as good as what I get even on the small mirrorless sensor. And this is of course a 4/3 of an inch sensor, and I don't know exactly what that is in millimeters. And whereas the P1000 sensor size is 1/2/3 of an inch, which is, according to the spec sheet, 6.2 millimeters by 4.6 millimeters. So it's a really tiny sensor. This camera has a bird mode. I don't know why, other than the only thing that I've been able to tell is that if you have it in bird mode and you push the OK button on the menu, it will zoom out to let you find the bird again, and then when you release it, it zooms back in to the bird, and I think it comes back out to like 400 millimeters or 500 millimeters, and then zooms all the way back to where you had it when you push the button. The biggest downside, and I have no idea why they did this, is that you can't shoot RAW if you're in bird mode, and I only shoot RAW on this camera just because, since the image quality is already somewhat low, and because of the low light performance, the images tend to come out underexposed. If you have the setting to limit the max ISO to 400, which I do, I'll want those RAW files to be able to pull up the shadows and pull up the exposure to get some of the detail back. So for that reason, bird mode, in my experience so far, is pretty much worthless. One thing that you'll hear people complain about a lot with this camera is the size. I mean, it is decently big, but if you're using this, if the alternative to this is going to be a spotting scope, then you might as well plan on carrying some weight, and this isn't that much more than a spotting scope. So if you look, here's the 100 to 400 on the GX85, and here's the Nikon D850. So the D850, not the D850, I wish it was the D850. The P1000 is quite a bit bigger, but it's reasonable if you're, again, comparing it to a spotting scope, which in my case is what I would be carrying instead of this. This camera, just as a street photography camera or something like that, shooting at 24 millimeters, which is the smallest focal length that this camera has, I don't know if I would be comfortable taking it out just doing day-to-day photography. It is really big and noticeable for something like that. Though that said, I have set it up and use some of the special modes on this, like to shoot the moon, or not the moon, but to shoot time lapses. I've used it to shoot the moon. There's a moon mode too, which again doesn't let you shoot raw. But I think if you're interested in taking a photo of the moon, you can do that and get pretty close. A couple other minor points with this camera: the way the autofocus button is and the manual focus button, for some reason it always seems to get flicked back and forth in my bag. So when I turn the camera on, it's on manual focus. In fact, it was on manual focus just now. A minor annoyance, but something that I've noticed with it. Another thing that I only noticed when I was trying to put on a big rubber lens hood to shoot the time lapse, against a window to avoid the reflection, is that if you bump the zoom lens while the camera's on, the camera has to be turned off, which retracts the zoom lens, and then turn back on, even after if it's just been bumped a little bit. So it for some reason can't reset itself without restarting the whole camera, which is a minor annoyance, but again, something to note. One really nice thing the camera has is a Hotshoe, it does have a Hotshoe, and then it has a port for the microphone. So I have a little field recorder, a zoom field recorder that I can stick on top of the camera. And since it does so well with video, it's nice to be able to have really good audio along with it. So that's been definitely kind of a surprising feature for a bridge camera, but something that's come in really handy on this. So I think my overall recommendation, if you set your expectations right, which is that your still images will be okay, maybe not something you would sell especially or print, but probably perfectly fine to share on social media. In fact, I've done that a bunch on my Instagram account, which is at Marcus Birding. It's good for that, good for stills that are of documentation quality or maybe social media quality. And then expect the video to be pretty good, maybe a little bit over sharpened, but overall fairly decent quality. Expect it to be the size that it is, and not weather sealed. And don't expect it to be as snappy as a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. The menus are fairly quick to navigate, but other things, especially just after you take a shot, sometimes there's just a bit of lag before you can take the next shot. And that lag is not just waiting for the file to be written, or maybe that is what's happening, but the effect of it is that you can't change the zoom, and sometimes the previous image that you shot will remain on the screen, and it just almost feels like the camera's just briefly frozen. It doesn't happen every time, and it's not super noticeable, but it is something that I've never experienced on my Panasonic cameras that I do notice with this camera every once in a while. With those expectations, if you're considering buying a spotting scope, which is going to run you easily the cost of this camera, if you want a nice one, double or triple the cost of this camera, and your main interest is photography, or one of your primary interests is photography, or you're looking to do this instead of digiscoping, I definitely recommend this camera. It's worked out, it's been really fun to use, and it almost feels like having a bit of a superpower when I'm out there and I can shoot at 3,000 millimeters, especially after I've just become so used to shooting at about 800 millimeters, 400 on the Micro Four Thirds system. So yeah, get it if your needs are the same as mine were. Oh, and one other thing that I did not like about this camera was that it had all kinds of logos and 4K this, and I don't remember what all they were. So if you notice, mine doesn't even say Nikon here anymore, because when I got the electrical tape to black out the 4K and the HD or whatever all it was, I also just blacked out all of the things. So there was a Nikon logo here, there was text here showing the focal length and the filter size, there was the logos here, there were logos here, there was a Coolpix logo somewhere down on the bottom. Anyway, lots of logos all over the camera, and they're all gone now. And I like it better like this. So here, take care of that however you will. Thanks for watching.